people just shout at each other because they think that's what makes the ratings. The average of Belarus protests in Russian state media is very, very, I would say, uneven. They even, this is something that's never happened before in the history of Russian state news agencies. Put him in front of a camera and feed him some methamphetamines, and that would be it.
Welcome to The Naked Pravda. I'm your host, Kevin Rothrock, the managing editor of Meduza's English language edition. And I'm recording this on Friday, September 18th. And on today's show, we're going to talk about Belarus, where President Alexander Lukashenko has been in trouble, in some hot water, since about August 9th, when he was allegedly reelected. There have been large-scale protests ever since. And on today's show, we're going to look back at two sort of PR escapades. The first one, a failed publicity campaign from about a decade ago, and then we're also going to look at the Belarusian state media's latest reinvention, courtesy of Russian propagandists. About a decade ago, when a conflict over tariffs on Russian energy products strained the relationship between Alexander Lukashenko and Vladimir Putin to the breaking point, the Belarusian president endeavored briefly but brazenly to repair his standing in the West. He had help from a man named Timothy Bell, Lord Timothy Bell, in fact, the founder of Pottinger, once one of the most influential PR firms in the world. One of the publicity campaign's major goals was to undo Lukashenko's reputation as Europe's last dictator, a phrase U.S. Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice used in April 2005 to describe him. You may have heard this phrase. It stuck. Pottinger's political strategists were hired to help end Belarus's international isolation, persuade the West to lift foreign sanctions, and help establish ties to organizations like the IMF and the World Bank, which could conceivably have helped the country manage the loss of trade with Russia. To do this, the firm facilitated press tours in Belarus for Western reporters and interviews with Belarusian state officials. There were also articles and supplements published in several Western newspapers and magazines about Belarus as a new travel destination and a place to invest your money. The campaign was a failure, of course. There are certainly authoritarians who managed to get along with the West without much public controversy, but Alexander Lukashenko could not pull it off. 12 years later, most of the people who participated in the Pottinger scheme are reluctant to discuss it. Some of them, like Lord Bell, are now dead. Meduza investigative editor Alexey Kovalev nevertheless managed to reconstruct details of the operation's timeline and verify that Boris Berezovsky, the Russian oligarch, who died in 2013, played a key role in the whole affair.
I started looking at closer at this story, trying to find some leads, trying to find some ex-employees of the firm, to find journalists who were based in Minsk at the time, or foreign diplomats, and basically anyone I could find. And yeah, everyone thought it was a sham, it was a complete shambles, and that's why it failed so spectacularly, because neither side actually knew what the other could actually do, what it was capable of. They very much overestimated their own abilities and overestimated their clients' abilities and so on.
In the story, you mentioned that Boris Berezovsky played this large role. Is he essentially the connection between Lord Bell and Lukashenko? How did they end up in a room together?
Actually, it was all Berezovsky's idea. And it was one of the unexplained mysteries of this relationship, because you couldn't find two more different people than Alexander Lukashenko and Lord Timothy Bell. They are from completely different worlds. And yet somehow they did end up in a room together, because for Boris Berezovsky, the crazy scheming oligarch, always pulling the strings in one country and jetting from one country to another all the time, it was pretty natural for him to just cook up this crazy scheme where he would pull Lukashenko closer to the West and form an alliance with Belarus, Ukraine, and other countries transporting Russian oil and gas, but may have a sort of a different relationship with Russia, that he would help them form an alliance, and that this alliance would impose stricter tariffs on Russia for transporting Russia's oil and gas. And that's how he would get back at Putin for crossing him, or whatever was in his mind. I cannot really know, because he was such a chaotic person. So he came up, one of his talents was coming up with these absolutely insane ideas and getting people on board. So he managed to get both Lukashenko and Timothy Bell in the room, and they struck a deal.
Berezovsky struck when the iron was hot, so to speak. Before he managed to get Lukashenko and Lord Bell together in a room, the Russian media was beating up Lukashenko on TV, insulting him, and saying all kinds of nasty things in exposés.
It was a very opportune time because at this point, Lukashenko was on the receiving end of Russian state propaganda and sanctions and whatever. Basically, what's happening with Ukraine now, but on a smaller level, sounds the war and tanks and annexations. But yeah, there was a 5-part series on NTV, the kind of sort of private propaganda channel that's not exactly state owned. It's not, at least not formally so. But it's pumping out the dirtiest, the most insane propaganda, targeting the opposition. But this time, back in 2010. So there was a 5-part series about Lukashenko, which painted him as this corrupt dictator, basically what he is. But there was a lot of that, like what's happening on Russian state television now, but the opposite. Lukashenko was quite angry and scared of it, so he kind of wanted to join a different, leave the club and join a different party. It was a very opportune moment for both, because that was kind of Bell Pottinger's thing, helping difficult people in difficult situations. So yeah, the Berezovsky, who had always stayed kind of in the shadows in this, because both Lukashenko, both Belarus and Bell Pottinger, they'd always say that they were just two parties to this contract, just them. Lord Bell had always said in interviews that all the bills were paid by the Belarus government and there was no other kind of intermediary there. But yeah, it was actually Berezovsky's idea. And like many of Berezovsky's idea, it was a complete and utter failure from the start.
One of the cameramen who worked on that NTV sort of mini-series, which I guess the title translates roughly to Godfather.
So the title of the Godfather in Russia is Krestny Otets. And Batka is Ukrainian / Belarusian / kind of vernacular Russian. And Batka means father.
And so one of the cameramen who worked on that sort of docu-series is now apparently in Minsk helping Russian state journalists sort of put the Belarusian state media back on track. And it's not as simple as just replacing the journalists and the technical staff who walked off the job in protest. It's a bit more nuanced than that. And you have this other article where you dive into this. Can you explain, as far as we know, what exactly are these dozens of Russian journalists doing now in Belarus?
Okay, so basically, because these people have no shame at all or conscience, the same people who would tarnish, paint Lukashenko as this crazy, unhinged, and corrupt dictator, the same very people are now helping him, now propping him up.
It's 10 years later, too. You'd assume that they'd think even worse of him after another decade in power.
Pretty much the same people are propping him up against these unprecedented protests. Simply because, we're going into the speculation area here, but I don't think Putin likes Lukashenko very much, but he's just really scared of close neighbor being uprooted and booed out of office by a bunch of angry color revolutionaries, something. So the same people who are painting him as this bad guy 10 years ago are now helping him set up his propaganda machine, because up to now, it was quite peculiar. The Belarusian propaganda had its many quirks, but it's never been as professional, I would say, as the Russian state television, because it's quite quaint. It had its own memes about the same propaganda tropes that we're seeing in Russia, with the Americans are plotting, and because it's Belarus, the Poles on the border, Poland is also plotting to overthrow Lukashenko, something, and sending spies and whatever. The spy mania, the anti-Americanisms and everything. But it was, if you look at Belarusian state TV like a year ago, it's quite, how would I put it, less exciting than what you normally see on Russian state television. But now I'm following a lot of Belarusian pro-government, pro-Lukashenko media and social media channels, because they At some point, not so long ago, they must have realized that they're getting hammered on social media because the messaging on the state television is so. There's a word for that in Russian, dubovy. It's like it's made of wood. It's made of oak wood.
Wooden.
Yeah, it's so wooden and inflexible, and it's really unlike the Belarusian state TV to be so fixated on Ukraine and Maidan and that sort of thing, because they've never been too worried about Maidan happening in Minsk, and the only thing the only time Ukraine would be brought up if they interviewed some refugee from Donetsk, setting up a new life in his quiet, well-managed Belarus. And now it's all Ukraine, Maidan, all the time. Now you can see it like every Lukashenko speech, every news segment on Belarusian state TV. It's all Maidan. So it's clearly it does seem like it's been imported from somewhere where this is a major subject on state propaganda. And it was imported by someone who didn't give it much thought about the local complexities and local sentiment, and they would just take this whole matrix of these typically Russian subjects and just make a carbon copy of it and take it to a newsroom at Belarus state television, and that's what it looks like. I've talked to a few people, and yeah, it looks like the initial sentiment. The initial rumors that I saw online was that so many people actually on Belarusian state television walked out that they had to import these strikebreakers from Moscow. Like, I'm seeing these, these typical rumors on social media. Like, my cousin who works at Belarus state television says there are 2 plane loads of these strikebreakers from Moscow that just touched down at Minsk International Airport, and they're going to fill in all those empty seats in these newsrooms. But actually, no, that didn't happen.
For listeners who maybe don't have a good sense of kind of what makes Russian TV more sensationalistic than, say, Belarusian TV, because I imagine, there are some people out there listening that don't watch either, and they maybe they're familiar with the idea of Russian propaganda, but they don't necessarily know what Russian TV for Russians looks like. How would you compare it to a major U.S. television network? Like, is NTV or Первый канал, these Russian networks, is it like Fox News? Is it like MSNBC? Like, how would you compare those outlets?
I'd say it's very, very, very Fox. So some primetime talk shows have clearly been lifted from Fox and Friends and that kind of thing. And there's definitely a touch of Sean Hannity and definitely Tucker Carlson here and there. And if you're from the UK, that would probably be, like, pick any Daily Telegraph columnist and put him in front of a camera and feed him some methamphetamines, and that would be it. It's a lot of Fox News, and sometimes veering right into one American news network. Sometimes it's a lot more Fox than Fox. So yeah, it's what you can characterize as would be, it's very loud. Most of the political talk shows on Russian state television are basically scream fests. So people just shout at each other because they think that's what makes the ratings. And actually, in Joshua Yaffa's book, Between Two Fires, he actually talked to one of these people on these Russian political talk shows. And the guy, after the shooting, the guy would be, the guy who would just threaten to throw things at him or curse him on air would be really friendly and nice, and he would just say, "Well, it's a job. I mean, we know what makes the ratings, so that's what we're doing." So it's very loud, it's very hysterical, it's very conspiratorial. That's what Belarus state television and pro-government social media look like now.
It's my understanding that Russian state TV generally tends to follow the government's lead, whereas, say, Fox News, at least in the United States, seems to be the other way around sometimes, where Trump seems to be getting his ideas from Fox News, whereas at least in the Belarus situation, at first it seemed, and this you talk about this in your article, at first many of the Russian news outlets didn't seem to know how to cover it. Like there were kind of wide disparities in the tone that they took. Some attempted to be far more objective, and they actually entertained the numbers that the protesters were citing, Russia Today was not one of those outlets, but there wasn't a consensus at first, at least. It seems like one has maybe emerged now, but there was a bit more pluralism at first.
Yeah, it's quite unusual, I would say, for someone who's been watching and closely following these Russian state media. I'd say it's quite unprecedented for something, especially as a foreign policy matter, especially one that's happening so close to Russia. It's quite unusual for the Russian state media not to have a very well choreographed and imposed on them in a top-down manner from the Putin's administration. It's quite unusual. I mean, it's the coverage of Belarus protests in the Russian state media is very, very, I would say, uneven. This is something that's never happened before in the history of Russian state news agencies, especially not TASS. But they are actually disputing the official police figures of these tendencies at rallies. So RT would, for example, I'm covering this in my article. RT would say, okay, so according to the Belarus Interior Ministry, there were 20,000 people at this protest, and actually TASS would say the Belarus Interior Ministry claims there was some 20,000 people at this protest. A headline that you would never see in TASS in relation to Russia, for example. So a Russian state news outlet would never question the police's figures. And then, of course, they were like close to 100,000 people. But yeah, that's a different matter. We've been joking. How can they go back to covering the protests in Moscow in the way they usually do after this?
There is this big generational divide which exists in the way media are consumed.
That's Alex Kovalev, a country risk analyst who focuses on Belarus, Russia, Ukraine, Eurasia, and the Caucasus. I asked him about changes in the Belarusian media landscape since the protests started on August 9th, and he was quick to point out that a lot of people aren't tuned in to the TV networks or even the newspapers anymore. If you're a millennial or younger, you're online.
I think in countries like Belarus, it's much more pronounced, where the older people generally don't use, say, smartphones and applications on smartphones as much as, say, their peers would in Western Europe or US. So as a result, older people tend to rely on more traditional media, such as TV, which in case of Belarus is state TV, and print media, which again, mostly state-controlled media. But younger people predominantly use social media, and they are completely ignorant of what happens on TV. They never watch TV because there's nothing, from their perspective, there's nothing interesting for them there. And they never read government-controlled print media. So there is a very big divide in the way how information is consumed. And you would have a generation, say, of retired people who have a completely different worldview because of the media they consume. And then you have these younger people in their 20s and their 30s, and especially even, teenagers who are on Telegram and who consume media completely in a different way. And as a result, they are on Telegram, on TikTok, on YouTube, whatever social media they are. And their worldview is completely different. And the information they receive about events in the country and outside of the country is completely different to that of their, say, parents or grandparents.
It's my impression that a lot of Western observers are tempted to think of Belarus as, and the Lukashenko regime as basically a miniature version of Russia and the Putin regime. Are there problems with that comparison, or do you think that's a reasonable way to look at it?
There are problems with this comparison because Russia is a much larger and as a result a much more complex country with much more complex power hierarchies. Belarus is a much smaller country, and as a result, it's much more centralized compared to Russia. In Russia, you have all these multiple levels of local, regional elites, sectoral elites, which, compete for resources, and they interact one way or another. In Belarus, everything is much more streamlined, and because it's a much smaller country. And because of the system which Lukashenko built over the past 26 years, which is much more vertically integrated, I would call it, compared to Russia, which still has a degree of autonomy and has multiple clans and multiple power structures. Belarus is much leaner in this respect and much more centered on Lukashenko compared to the system which exists in Russia. I think in Russia, the whole political system is more decentralized, and Putin plays a role of chief arbiter, while Lukashenko plays a role of an absolute monarch.
You've been listening to The Naked Pravda, an English language podcast from Meduza. On today's show, we heard from Meduza investigative editor Alexey Kovalev about his 2 recent reports on media schemes in Belarus, a failed attempt about a decade ago to rescue Alexander Lukashenko's reputation in the West, and an ongoing effort by Russian state journalists to steer the Belarusian state media in the midst of nationwide protests. And we spoke to Alex Kokcherov, a country risk analyst who focuses on Belarus and the former USSR, for a sense of the generational divides in media consumption in Belarus today. The Naked Pravda is a podcast from Meduza, our first English language show, and I hope you recommend us to your friends and leave a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're tuning in to help put this program in front of more people. Thank you for listening and come back soon.